Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Where or Were, depending on how you want to pronounce this movie. So, going into this film, we have a character who is suffering from an illness called Porphyra in this movie, and it seems that this character is to suffer a huge amount of hair growth, and so that also comes with a number of kind of illnesses uh, to eventually have this character supposedly have the accusations brought in front of him to just kind of seem very inaccurate, or to him have no ability to reasonably be able to do this because of his disease that he is to have, or his rare disease. So let's tee it up. So Talon is to, of course, be this guy who is to be put to prison because supposedly uh, some woman of this family who had gone out of this whole situation alive was to mention that there was some very hairy looking man-ish like character that was to go and kill both her husband and son. And so immediately we have the police end up going and arresting this guy named Talon because he fits the bill. Well, we have Kate Moore, or Catherine Moore, eventually wanting to defend Talon and maybe quite possibly come up with a much more reasonable accusation than maybe this mother would have really come up with. Because it seems that she's probably saying all this maybe under stress or just shock or whatever. We may not be able to really believe anything that this woman is actually to say here. So, uh, Kate's plan is to eventually uh, go and prove to these people that Talon is to have this rare illness, rare disease, and could not have been able to be having the ability to be strong enough or to have the teeth span or whichever to have eventually been uh, going and killing any number of these people because he just wouldn't have this kind of ability. I really like the kind of the intelligence that is to be crafted in this film. I really like and enjoy kind of this different approach where you have a man that is overly hairy, anyways, and I love that idea. To me, I was just like, well, there are several people. Like, if you go into a show called Ripley's, believe it or not, there's to be this one episode where there had been people that suffer like the werewolf syndrome, where they end up having like hair grown throughout their entire body to where you could not really see a stitch of real skin unless they shaved it all off. You could also go into a movie called Fur, um, which has Nicole Kidman and Robert Downey Jr., and you can see Robert Downey Jr.'s character very Chewbacca-esque because his character had kind of this werewolf syndrome, or just absurdly grew hair a lot. So I've kind of researched this to just kind of beforehand to just kind of find unique cases where there are people that are to grow large amounts of her hair all over the body for whatever reason. Because I'm also a hairy guy, so why not just kind of go into the cases of eventually hairy people eventually getting overly hairy, and of course getting called any number of names for that. Like, I know when I was in high school, quite a few people would just be like, "Hey, you're growing so much hair. You're a werewolf." I'm like, well, whatever. it's not like absurdly so to where it covers my entire body, but whatever. I guess absurd amount of hair, I guess. But anyways, so like I liked this kind of film because you end up having a guy that is to seem like he's going to be written off as being this monstrous being, and then they figured out a way to eventually not have him be a huge monstrous being. And so it's kind of the like, let's figure out if this guy is to actually have done this or not, which is the interesting case. So going into this film, I really did enjoy it. It's a real enjoyable piece, and plus, there's like a science behind being a werewolf. How it seems that someone who is to have this kind of disease or illness or whatever, and it seems quite possible that they could have certain kind of seizures, and then eventually there might be some kind of thing with the moon causing this person to have this uh, seemingly ability much more beyond just saying like, oh well, he's actually just a werewolf. No, it seems like they actually come up with the science behind it. And so yeah, so it makes for a very interesting movie. I really enjoyed it. uh like I would say that one, this movie does feel cheap. In all actuality, there are points in time when they have to do these kind of goofy camera angles and so on and so forth. Parts of this movie, of course, is in French at some points because there are people, like, basically, this is to be in a French setting, so not every single second of this movie is going to be in English. There are, of course, our subtitles. Where can you go to find this film? Well, right now, the second of this recording, this movie is on an app called Tubi. Justifiably, I would say go ahead and check this movie out. I actually enjoyed it. Um, I actually would say this is a good enough watch. I wouldn't go into great territory just because, again, kind of the way it was shot, uh, how like there were like the way of which that they do this story is good enough. I I don't think I have a problem with the story. I don't think there's anywhere where I kind of second guess things, or I would just say, like, if rationally we're gonna do it this way, like I think I can just be fine with how this story is approached. Um, I think, and also there are some times when this movie does surprise me, where I'm like, okay, like it seems like they end up putting a little bit more money into this kind of scene or this kind of part or whatever. So I could be a little bit more impressed. But other than that, um, just overall a smart film and an overall just kind of interesting way of approaching a werewolf movie. If that's what we're really to do here, so to speak. Just trying to, like, is it a werewolf movie? Is it not a werewolf movie? Is it just a guy that is overly hairy and has some condition, and people are really just taking advantage of it? And to just say that, oh, this guy who is to be overly hairy, because there is to eventually be a bear being thrown into the mix into this film. So is this guy the murderer? Is it something else? Is it someone else? Let's go out of our way to say that it is that customary time yet again. Just go into spoilers about this movie because it's about that time to otherwise say it's spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, uh, we end up having this video being done to this family, and so there's to be Henry, who's to be the dad, Peter, who's to be the son, Claire, who is to be, of course, the wife. So they all go out in this camping outing, and so it seems that the father is to talk about these certain things in outer space and all this, like talking about ice and whatever goofy things. And both Claire and Porter, or both Claire and Peter, are to just say, yeah, sure, it sounds like he knows what he's talking about. I don't know if I can buy everything that he's saying, but like it sounds like he's ballparkingly right or correct or whatever. So maybe it seemed probably in the script that supposedly this guy was gonna like seem more accurate or whatever, but maybe like the way in which that he delivered it, the family was like, I don't know if I buy that. So Henry is to eventually go and kind of take his dog on this leash, but he ends up losing this dog to eventually lose it into the forest. All of a sudden, Henry's to just kind of try and find his dog, to I think eventually have the dog go and end up being dead. And then the next thing we know it, cameras are being thrashed around, people are being thrashed around. Um, this is kind of like the beginning of this is kind of like a find footage kind of moment, or it could seem like most of this movie may be like a found footage kind of moment. But yeah, so the next thing we are to see is Claire in this hospital bed. Uh, Eventually, the later part in this movie, we end up kind of seeing her kind of turn her head, and man, her face just wow. But yeah, so Claire is to mention that a person that is to seemingly be a man who is absurdly hairy is to have gone and murdered this family. And so immediately we have Catherine Moore, who is taking on this case because Kate or Catherine has kind of had these kind of cases once before, and so eventually she's again going to send in her expert uh, Gavin to maybe quite possibly dispel that this is impossible for this man to go and murder the way of which that these people are to be murdered. So uh, Gavin is to come in, and so we end up having this Eric guy who is to immediately talk to Gavin, and so it seems that Kate and Gavin are to have this history, and Eric is getting a whiff of that, and so Eric is just to kind of tell Gavin at some point, it's like, well, hey, like you're not really gonna try to like come back here to try to rekindle things with Catherine, are you? And Gavin is like, you know what? I'm just here to do my job, man. So, but it just seems like Gavin kind of has this like touchy feely kind of thing with Kate, really just trying to like figure out a way to get like close to her or to try to probably say the right thing at the right time. Uh, Kind of also eventually having Gavin eventually tell Catherine at some point that he does miss her, and so Catherine is to mention it's like, well, hey, just spend more time with me. I'm sure you'll grow to hate me. So, uh, so eventually, what happens is that Gavin is to go and inspect the bodies and mention that there is no way that a human being could do something like this. That the marks seem much more like animalistic than human, and we end up kind of hauling the bodies out. And so maybe for some people that don't like human remains or stuff like that, because these bodies look torn apart, maybe this might not be a thing for you. Um, but yeah, so uh, Gavin is to say it's an animal because evidently he had done a case with Catherine once before, dispelling that it could be human, that it was actually some animal somewhere. So eventually, Catherine is to go and talk to Talon, and so they end up having him in this weird body like chained up thing, and Catherine is to tell these guys, take this thing off of him. Like, this is wrong. Like this is very humane for this guy to be just hooked up into all this kind of equipment, whatever. He's not Hannibal Lecter just yet. So don't put him in this weird getup. It doesn't make sense. To even Catherine is to even ask for his handcuffs to come off. So that way this guy could feel more at ease with Catherine and eventually want to talk to her because it seems like he's not to talk much. And luckily this guy can speak English because Catherine at first is to talk to him in French, but he ends up saying thank you and she's like, oh, you know English? And Talon is like, well, yeah, like I learned. So eventually, like Catherine is to eventually talk to Talon about his mother and his father, just to kind of see like if there's like somebody that she can get in touch with. And eventually, she does go and speak to Talon's mother and kind of ask her some questions. So there is to be this one instance where uh, eventually the guards are to eventually just say that her time is up. And she's like, well, wait a minute, I need more time. And all of a sudden, like, they end up starting to tase uh, Talon and dropping him down. And Gavin is to just try to rush in and try to, like, stop what's going on. And Gavin ends up going and getting some teeth marks from Talon by accident for his trouble. Like Talon didn't bite down on Gavin. It was just an accidental, just kind of like, hey man, like trying to like stop everything. So eventually they find out that uh, Talon is to quite possibly have this disease slash disorder, and so eventually they come up with a consensus that there's, or the defense, that there is no way for Talon to have been able to, with these even being an animalistic, more like attack, he does not have the ability to do any number of these things because of his disease, where eventually he would not have the strength that is required for him, or he would not have uh, the ability to do any number of these things because like he wouldn't be able to move all that well. Like, and it's obvious that when Talon is just kind of moved the way he is, like it's very difficult. And so they're trying to make that consensus that there's no way that this guy can tear through these family members like they're nothing, with the fact of that this person can barely can barely move around at all. And so this person had never been specifically diagnosed with the illness that I've mentioned early in this movie, or in this review, I mean. And so they need to go and diagnose this man of this disease, of this illness. But so Kate is to go off and is to talk to Mrs. Uh, Gipnek, Talon's mother. And so Catherine goes to speak to this mother. And so it seems that Talon had gotten his uh, hairy hairy skin seemingly from his father's side, and so Catherine is to eventually just kind of ask, it's like, okay, well, like, did his father have kind of like the longer teeth and this and that, and mother's like, yeah, had all of that, abnormally tall and all this kind of stuff. So eventually, they're kind of putting it together that this isn't a rare thing; it's an inherited thing, and like that this guy just got unusual, abnormal genes. No, he eventually just inherited all these genes from his father. So eventually, it seems that this character could quite possibly be getting or had gotten seizures, and Talon could have at some point blacked out and could have not have been possibly tied to this murder and whatever. And so, anyways, so eventually, what ends up happening is that uh, there's to be a rock being chucked through this home to say that Talon is this killer, is this murderer, and the mother is just dispelling all that. Plus, uh, we also have these people at this kind of facility that or nuclear facility that had wanted to consistently try and dump huge amounts of toxic waste right around kind of Talon's home. And so eventually there is some quite possible suspicions that Talon could have easily gone after these people and gotten large a large set of money, like millions upon millions of dollars, for all the toxic waste that they had dumped upon their uh, nearby their home. And so, weirdly enough, we had Claus uh, Piston or Pistor. I apologize for ill pronouncing that. Uh, Claus, this detective that is to be weirdly also in this case, was also to be on the other case of the nuclear waste dumping. And so I think this Claus character is to desperately want to go and imprison Talon for these murders because so that way he never goes after these nuclear waste people and sues them for huge chunks of money. And so like there's something there that seems kind of this whole planned thing where they were trying to figure out some kind of tactic to try and get Talon arrested for something. So kind of Catherine is really starting to build up her defense. And it's like, you know what, I think we're probably going to end up getting this guy off. If we can just go in and have him being diagnosed as having this illness, then there's no way that any court would go and justify this guy being this murderer person. So, all of a sudden, they end up doing these things. And so Talon is to go on and be like set up to have to go and have his eye being forcibly opened so that way they can kind of scrape a certain uh, part of his eye and put it on some test tube some kind of slide so they can eventually go and test to see if this guy has this disease. Evidently, there's some kind of formula that they can mix together to eventually hit against this liquid that was coming from Talon's eye to showcase that this man does have this disease, this illness. And supposedly they do this test, and they're like, well, hey, test proved positive. So that's not only it, they also weirdly want to uh, go and have this guy being in front of this strobe light to have him forcibly go into a seizure. I'm like, why would you do that? I'm like, a person that could go into a seizure could possibly die. Like, I would just say, like, dude, I think the one test is good enough. Like, the if the test shows that he has it, then why go into further testing to risk this guy's life, possibly while having a seizure? That just seems kind of like ill advised. Just like, oh yeah, we definitely want to have this guy have a seizure so he might die. But I guess if anything, like what we're really doing here is eventually just escalating certain things. So Talon is eventually going to this strobe light, eventually supposedly going to this seizure, but instead, all of a sudden, his body is to start to morph or start to change slightly to eventually go into this rage moment and is to all of a sudden start killing people and just running through people and murdering most of the people in this room and then running off. And so uh, the people are to also realize that the full moon is out. And so all of a sudden, Eric is starting to make this consensus that Gavin could have quite possibly been marked by Talon, and that Gavin might be showing some signs of what is to have been a mimic of Talon's kind of illness. It seems that Gavin is just kind of show signs of kind of disorientation or something like that. Like as soon as he's got here, like there's something about him where he's just kind of saying that like maybe he's eating the wrong food, something like that, and where it's like Eric is like, I'm sorry, like the French don't go out of their way to give you bad food. That's not the case. So Gavin is just kind of, I don't know, he's probably jet lagged or something like that. But anyways, so eventually, we just find out that Gavin is to eventually go and be just like Talon. That Gavin even goes and tests himself for the same disease that Talon is to have, and Gavin is to find out that he had tested positive for this same illness as Talon did, and he ends up accidentally cutting his eye open while doing this. So, pushing on. So, we eventually have Kate and Klaus and everybody trying to go out and find Talon. And so Talon just continues to just kind of rampage through people and start to hurt them. And so Eric makes the consensus that uh, there is something about the moon that could quite possibly put Talon into these rage-like stages, to where eventually the shape of the moon could quite possibly give Gavin, or give Talon, I mean, this uh, consistent kind of equal strobe lighting seizure that we just saw. Like the moon could have this ability upon Gavin to eventually keep him in this rage like state, and so on and so forth. Not literally turning him into a wolf, just kind of making him a much more like feat of strength like person, and to otherwise justify that this guy could rationally pull the things off and go and murder and kill and whatever all kinds of people. And so eventually Talon is to break free from the prison of which that he is being held at. And so now the police are going after him. They're sending SWAT and all kinds of things to try to get try to get Talon, and the police end up failing. And so eventually Talon is to go and fly from out of this building to crash onto the ground, and but he ends up not hurting himself. And so Talon ends up just going off and is to eventually go into the woods where eventually people are to go after him. And so eventually Kate, Gavin, Eric, and all the police are going after and Talon. And so eventually what ends up happening is Gavin is to go into Talon's home to eventually find out that Talon's mother had like set up this chair where Talon was to be strapped into to just kind of like I guess control um, Talon's Talon's rage like thing going on with him. So Gavin is to mention that Talon's mother knew good and well that Talon was to have these rage moments, and so kind of saying that there was like a moment here where uh, Talon is to, of course, be known to have been doing this, and so on and so forth. So, anyways, we end up having a moment where Gavin is to now have to fight it out uh, with Talon's mother, and so she ends up going and chucking an axe at Gavin, and it ends up missing him. And so I guess for defense of himself, Gavin just goes and beats sadly Talon's mother to death, and then eventually goes and finds this razor, like this kind of like old fashioned. You know how like you would shave your like hair by hand or whatever. So all of a sudden, Gavin takes this razor and goes and like shaves everything of hair on his entire face, even his eyebrows and everything. Even though when you look in the scenes, you can kind of tell that they probably might have like messed up a scene with his eyebrows, but oh well, like it doesn't really matter. So eventually, Gavin is to shave every bit of hair from his whole entire head. I guess to be the opposite of werewolf. Instead of having like all of his hair, he has none. So I'm like, okay, that's an interesting way to approach this. To kind of have this vastly different. If you have one person with hair and one person without, like it kind of makes for like this interesting thing. And I kind of wish like there was more like that out there where uh, you end up having just kind of werewolf where it's not really having to be this like werewolf like character where he has tons of hair and whatever. So kind of doing like some Wolfman interesting things here. So eventually Catherine is to try and kind of calm Talon down with the police officers, and eventually that just doesn't go anywhere. Talon eventually kind of rams through a lot of these police officers. Eventually, at some point, Talon is to eventually find Eric and is to basically rip off like his bottom jaw, and I'm just like, oh my god, that's some gruesome shit right there. Um, but yeah, because Eric is just like, well, hey man, I'm not afraid of you. Like, I'm not how everyone else is, and whatever. And so Gavin, Talon just brutally grabs Eric's. Why do I keep saying Gavin? Good God. Um, Talon rips out Eric's jaw and just kills him that way, horrifically. So, all of a sudden, we have Klaus, who is up in this helicopter, going and like possibly going to start uh, like snipering Talon, and so we have this moment where Talon is going and seemingly going to do something with Catherine. But we have this weird moment where Talon is kind of just like maybe feeling Catherine for whatever goofy reason. Like as if he's going to try and spurn a child out of this woman. I don't know. It's kind of a very weird moment. And so all of a sudden we end up having Gavin who comes to Catherine's defense. And so now it's Talon versus Gavin, and loser leaves town. So both Gavin and Talon are fighting it out, and like bullets does nothing with these characters. I guess it just quickly heals them, and I guess there was to be this one point, I think, where Claus was to eventually try and shoot Catherine, but it's not a death blow. So I think eventually at one point, either Gavin or Talon is to grab somebody and chuck it against this helicopter to just kind of force them down, because they continue to try to shoot them. So Gavin and Talon are battling it out to eventually just have seemingly where Gavin is to eventually go take Talon and eventually drown him, and we are to assume that Talon is to be dead, but we aren't really quite sure because it seems that Talon could still be on the loose. And also, Gavin is to still tell that Talon is to be a werewolf of some kind. So, we're naturally assuming that Talon is not dead here. So I guess that's the real conclusion here is to, like, I guess Talon's not dead, even though it looked like he had died. But yeah, so it seems that probably Claus is trying to figure out a way to kill Talon, so that way he doesn't go after anybody for that money. But also, I guess he's seen as a real, true threat here. But I don't think anybody's going to be dusting out the silver bullets to try and kill this character that way, because I don't think a silver bullet is going to work in this case. So, the one weakness to a possible werewolf isn't probably going to work. So that kind of sucks. I guess you would have to just kill him in like a worst possible scenario like way, to either burn him to the stake somehow or another, because good luck with that, or explosions, or possibly like head off. Chopping off the head would probably work, because it seems like they didn't do that in this movie. But yeah, so I think that is about the wrapping up of which that I will possibly do with this movie. There's obviously some stuff where I just kind of rushed through, like kind of the action sequences. I just kind of didn't take much marination, or just kind of slowing of that to just kind of like get every single beat and whatever out of that. But like I think I did a good enough job of trying to explain this movie to people, because there's a lot of like intelligent things kind of talked about here. So a smart werewolf movie, and that's what I think I kind of enjoyed about it, was just like how many times would you kind of go through a werewolf movie and they would always be like, Oh no, I don't even know what a werewolf is. Like, I need to go and figure this out. Like, that is always a stupid thing when you end up going into a werewolf movie where it seems that nobody knows anything and they're the dumbest rocks people. Um, it's kind of nice to get that change where it seems like we have highly intelligent people that are to just kind of dissect this thing. And so I found this movie enjoyable, and some people may not. But anyways, let me know in the comments below how you felt about where or were or are war. Um, Let me know how you felt about this movie. I enjoyed it. Like, I enjoyed, like, this kind of feels like a vastly different kind of werewolf movie. I've been wanting to eventually try and find like another werewolf movie. Like, I've been wanting to try to find something unique that like, immediately there was like certain werewolf movies that kind of popped up in my mind where I was like, okay, maybe I'll have to do Cursed, because that might have some star power that interests people. Uh, but then eventually I kind of stumbled upon this movie. I'm like, oh, this visually looks interesting. What's the story here? And then I found out it's like, oh, well, it's one of those intelligent movies. I'm like, okay, this is gonna interest me a lot more. So I went into the trailer. I'm like, man, this looks really interesting. So I decided to go into this movie, and I was like, nah, really good. I really enjoyed it. Definitely go out of your way to find this film, and if you already have found this film, then good for you, because I enjoyed it. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.